Good evening and welcome to the India-Canada Friendship Circle. We respectfully acknowledge that the lands on which we are gathered are part of the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people. For those of you joining us from other regions, we encourage you to learn about the local traditions, history, culture, and land of Indigenous nations in your respective communities. For those of you who may be new to this forum, the India-Canada Friendship Circle, also known as ICFC, was established in 2004 as a nonprofit, non-religious, non-political organization. It aims to educate and promote dialogue through prominent experts in a variety of fields of interest to India and Canada. My name is Ruhi Ahmed. I'm president of ICFC, and it is my privilege to bring you greetings on behalf of our board of directors. It is also my privilege to welcome you all to our first lecture of this year under the theme of the environment. Today, we will examine the environment in the context of reconciliation and the relationship between our colonial past, Indigenous peoples, and place. Our topic today marks the special occasion of National Indigenous History Month, which is celebrated across Canada in the month of June. We are fortunate to have a distinguished speaker, such as Professor Bob Watts, who will offer a unique perspective, given his special ties to the Six Nations Indian Reserve, as well as to the Canadian Nuclear Waste Management Organization. Today's lecture also launches our environment series as we approach the one-year anniversary of the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which received royal assent in June 2021. The environment from which we derive food, energy, water, and clean air to breathe. This touches every aspect of human life and survival. Our experience with land and nature also plays a role in shaping national identity, culture, sport, and human behavior, as we saw in our diversity and inclusion lecture series held last year. We now hope to broaden that scope in the remainder of the year. We aim to look at how our experience with nature, whether meaningful or profound, can result in environmental concern and action in both Canada and India. I'd like to remind everyone once again that this event is being recorded live. And before we begin, as this is the India-Canada Friendship Circle, we like to get to know each other and also anyone new that may have joined us with a little introduction. And we encourage you to feel free to unmute yourselves, say hello, let us know who you are, where you're calling from, and not to be shy. So welcome anyone from the audience who would like to say hello. For an overview of today's program, we will have our guest speaker present for about half an hour, followed by a question and answer period with the audience for about another half hour. Mr. Prakash Diar will then provide a summary of key points, and we will close by keeping the lines open for anyone who may wish to stay and socialize. We used to hold these events in person for those who are new. And for the last couple of years, we've been following protocols and holding our events virtually. We hope to return to in-person events at some point in time when everyone's feeling safe enough. And we really miss that interactive and very social atmosphere that we had, meeting each other over tea and snacks. So we really miss that part. And so let us cross our fingers and hope that we would like to introduce Mr. Prakash Diar, who is our board member of ICFC. And thanks to Prakash, he is the one who proposed and invited today's guest speaker. So we're very grateful to you, Prakash, for thinking of Bob Watts and for bringing him to this forum today. Mr. Diar is a world-renowned international human rights expert. He's a lawyer and an author with a profound interest in anti-discrimination cases in Canada. Mr. Diar has also worked alongside the Minister and Deputy Minister of Justice on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's mandate to renew the Crown's relationship with Indigenous peoples. Mr. Diar, I turn the floor over to you to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Ruhi. It's wonderful to have everybody present today and gives me an opportunity to introduce my very good friend, Mr. Bob Watts. Give me one sec. So, hello, everyone. Thank you for the introductions, Ruhi. I'm really excited and really honored to introduce to you my very good friend, Mr. Bob Watts. We go back almost 2 decades. I used to be a special advisor to the Indian residential schools, and Bob and I crossed paths there, and Bob was an interim executive director there. He was also setting up the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Bob, I'm not too sure if you remember, but you sent me together with an elder, Indigenous elder, Dr. Maggie Hodson, to represent Canada at the 10th anniversary of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Bob has an extensive bio, and a summary is produced in the poster advertising this event. I will just highlight a few parts of his bio. As you will note, Bob is a man of many great talents. I wish we would have at least half a day with him. But since we do not have that much of time, today he will touch broadly on quotes in reconciliation, people and the place, the environment. And he will focus more on the environment from the Indigenous perspective, which is, as Ruhi has said, the first in its series. Bob will help us set the stage for our subsequent sessions that we will have on the environment. Bob will speak about 40 minutes and then we'll open it up to Q&As. I'm not exaggerating when I say Bob is a very busy man, and even I have had difficulty getting some time with him on a separate personal matter. But we are very fortunate to have him here and share with us this evening. He is a much sought after expert in Indigenous policy, negotiations, training, conflict resolution. Bob is currently the Vice President, Indigenous Relations and Strategic Programs at the Nuclear Waste Management Organization in Ontario. Bob has had the benefit of excellent Indigenous mentorship and Western learning, which allows him to work in both the worlds. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have 2 different worlds. And these 2 worlds are sometimes in conflict, especially when it comes to issues of land and how we view land and ownership and so forth. And I'm sure Bob will touch on some of that. Some of Bob's Indigenous learning has focused on medicine plants, traditional songs, and traditional environmental knowledge and leadership. Bob has also been a public servant, being an assistant deputy minister for the government of Canada, and held senior executive positions in Ontario as well. He's also a graduate of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, and a fellow of the Harvard Law School, where he researched and lectured on the role culture plays in conflict. Bob also served as the Chief of Staff of the National Chief of Assemblies of both Philfontaine and Perry Bellegarde. Bob is also an adjunct professor and distinguished fellow at Queen's University, where he developed one of the first graduate level courses on reconciliation in the country and reconciliation in its broader sense. Bob was recently appointed to the University Board of Trustees. He is also chair of the Gord Downey Cheney Wenjack Fund and chair of Reconciliation Canada. He is also the recipient of the IND Spire Award for Public Service and recently received an honorary doctorate of laws from McMaster University. He has taught, debated, lectured at a number of universities, both here in Canada and the US. Bob is from the Mohawk and Ojibwe nations and resides at Six Nations Reserve, where I had the good fortune of visiting Bob there. Bob carries and honors his Ojibwe spirit name, Kinu Zizing Wak. I hope I said that well, Bob, which means tall pine. But to me, if you see Bob in person, he's a big, tall man. He's more like a tall prince. And he's a member of the Bear Clan. Bob, it's my pleasure and all of our pleasure to have you share with us. It's over to you.
Good, thank you so much, Ruhi, for a warm welcome, and Prakash for that really beautiful introduction. Really appreciate all of your good words, and really happy to be here with all of you this evening, and honored to be part of this circle. And so I'm joining with you from Six Nations Indian Reserve near Brantford, Ontario. It's a Haudenosaunee or Iroquois community, and right next door to us, actually joined up with our reserve as Mississaugas of the Credit, another really fine First Nation here in southwestern Ontario. And I'm looking forward to this. I'm going to sort of spend some time talking about Indigenous worldview, which will speak to some of the environmental knowledge. I want to talk a little bit about history, because we are on this journey of reconciliation. And, you know, our journey of reconciliation and decolonization are sort of important pillars in terms of thinking about our future together and the environment in particular. And then probably spending a bit of time on, you know, some ideas about what we can do in terms of moving together for a better country, and therefore hopefully a greater appreciation of the land. So I have a presentation here. It's longer than what I'm going to present, so I'll be skipping over parts of it as we go through this. Let me just see. Steve, walk me through this. So
you want a slideshow? And then from the beginning, right here on the left end there. There we go.
Okay, so probably a good way to start is really talking about some Indigenous teachings in terms of worldview. Are you seeing this okay? Got a picture of my pipe there.
Yep.
Okay. And so, you know, this is, it's a really sacred item, our pipe, but it also talks about how we think about the world. And so with that pipe, in our way of talking about it, when we're in ceremony and we're smoking that pipe, we say that we're sitting with all of creation. And so why we say that, you look at that pipe and you see the pipe stone. And this reddish stone comes from, there's a few different areas of the country, both Canada and the United States, where you can find pipestone, but it stands for the mineral world. The world of the rock and the clay and soils and sand, everything that makes up the mineral world. And then you see the pipe stem there. And the pipe stem stands for the plant world or the plant kingdom. And everything that's in that plant kingdom is represented there. The trees, the shrubs, the flowers, the herbs, the mosses, the different grains and grasses, everything that is in that plant world is represented with that pipe stem. And then on the pipe bowl itself, it shows that face of an eagle there. And on pipes, sometimes there'll be a ring like that there, or sometimes you might have an eagle feather hanging from the pipe stem, but something that represents the animal world. And that stands for the flyers and the swimmers those that crawl on the ground and walk in the ground, and crawl under the ground. Everything that is part of that plant world is represented there. Then you have the world of humankind, the one who puts that pipe together. And in putting that pipe together, it stands for the many dualities that's found in the natural world. So then you have humankind putting that together, which stands for the world of humanity. And then you have the different elements. You put tobacco into the pipe, and you have fire to light the pipe. So fire is an element that's included. The wind is included, the breath to be able to smoke that pipe, the moisture on your breath, standing for water, and that wind and the earth all represented there. And then we ask the Creator, we ask the spirits to sit with us in that ceremony. So we say we're sitting with all of creation when we do that pipe ceremony. But it also speaks to these different worlds. And one of the things that we talk about from an Indigenous perspective is that we were the last to be created. We call ourselves the younger brother and sister of creation. That all these other worlds of existence were in place before we were created. The mineral world, the plant world, the animal world. And that the original instructions to those worlds of creation was to take care of us, to teach us how to survive here and to ensure our survival. And we see how those worlds of creation continue to do that. I mean, right now we're experiencing this summertime, and the strawberries are just starting to come on, and all this beauty of creation is in full bloom right now. And the earth is regenerating, it's producing, it's going to take care of us. And one of the things that we say is that because she takes care of us so well, and we think of the earth in the feminine, that we have a responsibility to take care of her. And it's a reciprocal relationship. We're taught that as she takes care of us, we should take care of her. And not just for ourselves, but to take care of her in a fashion that helps to ensure that future generations are taken care of. Sometimes we call that the 7-generation teachings, that we need to be thinking ahead 7 generations in terms of how we conduct ourselves on this earth. And then we kind of reflect back on, what our ancestors have done. Because, it's almost part of that land acknowledgement that we heard earlier. I mean, we're here and we're benefiting from this great love and affection and caring for the land that Indigenous ancestors have displayed over thousands and thousands of years. That all of us benefit from that. And that part of our duty is to ensure that that legacy carries on for future generations, and to display that love for the earth, so that your grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on can benefit from all this bounty and this beauty that surrounds all of us. So we talk about, in terms of our worldview, that idea about balance, that idea about our sacred duty to be caring for the earth, and ensuring that we leave the earth in such a way that she's able to continue to provide for future generations. We also have these, what we call the 7 grandfather teachings, which helps us think about how we should conduct ourselves in terms of our relationship with each other as humankind and relationship with all of creation. And these teachings differ because it'd be really difficult to say, like, here's a set of teachings that all Indigenous people have, because we have such huge diversity. Just within Canada, you have 634 First Nations, number of Métis communities, many Indigenous and Inuit communities across the north. So there's a lot of diversity. So there's very few things that are sort of pan-Indigenous in this country. But one of the things that seems to bind us together is this kinship with each other and relationship with the earth and the different teachings that we have. But these 7 generation teachings, or 7 grandfather teachings, are found in a lot of different cultures. And so these teachings are humility, bravery, honesty, wisdom, truth, respect, and love. And what we say is that these are good things to be taking into account in terms of how we make decisions. And I can tell you that I've witnessed how this has been done. I was working with a colleague not too long ago who was working on the issue of transportation of hazardous materials. And she wrote a paper on how to apply the 7 grandfather teachings in terms of thinking through the transportation of hazardous goods. So if you can do it for hazardous goods, you can do it for just about anything, I think. And these are just like really applying some things in a mindful and thoughtful way in terms of how we make decisions. The other part that goes hand in hand with the 7 grandfather teachings are the 7 generation teachings. That as we're making decisions today that we need to be taking into account 7 generations into the future, and thinking through what impact will the decisions we're having today, how will that impact 7 generations from now? And it may be hard to predict, everything that could happen in 7 generations, but there's probably a number of things that you could think about as potential impact. And then also, what are some of the potential mitigations with respect to those impacts that we could start to think about right now that actually may change what our decision-making looks like. So this is another good tool in terms of thinking through our relationship with the environment. So if we're talking about, forestry or mining or other sorts of activities on the land, to think through, what about 7 generations? What about those 7 grandfather teachings? What can that help? What can that tell us about how we would go about doing mining, or how we would go about doing forestry operations in a way that brings sort of the very best in terms of sustainability and Indigenous thought to bear on those matters. So who are the Aboriginal people of Canada? We're First Nation people, Métis people, Inuit people. I'm not going to go into this in huge detail because we could spend quite a bit of time on this, but just to say that these are all constitutionally recognized people in Canada. Section 35 of the Constitution recognizes and affirms the rights in Aboriginal and treaty rights of all of these peoples, recognizes that our treaties are part of Canada's foundation and part of its constitutional structure. And when we think about that, we think about none of these peoples were created by Canada. Our Indigenous nations have been here, in particular First Nation and Métis, our First Nation and Inuit nations have been here, we say, since time immemorial. The Métis came about because of the fur trade and the intermarriage and relationship between folks like the Hudson Bay Company and different Indigenous nations. But our people have been nations long before Canada was a nation, and we continue to be nations. And that's important when we think about relationship with each other. Aboriginal population of Canada is about 1.7 million, primarily First Nation, but quite a number of Métis people. Lots of controversy right now about who's Métis and who's not Métis. We don't have any really good definitions about that, but there's lots of work being done to sort that out, and about 65,000 Inuit people. One of the things that we're seeing is people sort of reclaiming their own language, their own culture, and starting to get rid of names that have been applied to us by colonizers, and using our own language to identify our place and our nation. And so it's something that you might want to be aware of in terms of your interaction with Aboriginal or Indigenous people. And even those terms are kind of umbrella terms, group terms. Most Indigenous people want to be identified by who they are, as a nation, not just sort of this really broad, all-encompassing term. The other thing that we say here is maybe not use some of there's some terms that are strictly derogatory that are pretty self-evident, but things that may not be, like by saying our Indigenous people or Canada's Indigenous people, and a lot of us sort of react to that saying, what do you mean, like your Indigenous people? Like, we're our own people. Even most of the definition in terms of what we call ourselves, it ends up being the people. And we were here long before Canada, so we're not Canada's Indigenous people. We may be Indigenous people in what's now called Canada, but we're not Canada's. So, you know, we've been here. Archaeological evidence points back to 40, 50, even now sometimes 75,000 years. Like a stunning variety of cultures across North America, languages just incredibly distinct from each other. City-states the size of London, England at the time of contact, but yet the explorers that came here talked about this as being unoccupied land or terra nullius, and applying things like the doctrine of discovery in terms of thinking about who the people that were here are, even debate about whether or not we're human beings. And then sort of this test of civilization that I'm sure many of your cultures experienced as well, in terms of the definition of civilization seeming to mean, are you Christian? And if you weren't Christian, then you weren't civilized. And if you weren't civilized, then there were certain rights that you didn't have. And somebody could come and plant a flag in your backyard and say, you know, I'm claiming this land on behalf of the Queen or the King or somebody else. But just that idea that the land was empty really speaks highly to the relationship that's evolved between Indigenous people and the colonizers, even thinking that in spite of the fact that there were human beings here, that it was still empty. And that sort of the land itself even had little value or little rights, really spoke to a colonial attitude in terms of the colonial relationship with the land, which was markedly different than Indigenous relationship with the land. We've, you know, there's a really good documentary at the Anglican Church of Canada if you're interested in exploring the doctrine of discovery, but it was a really racist doctrine that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission asked the various churches of Canada to disavow. I think all of them have, except for the Catholic Church, and hopefully when the Pope comes here, he'll disavow that. But at the same time, we see how some of our constitutions and our laws were helping to shape both what became Canada and the United States. The Great Law of Peace for the Haudenosaunee people helped the Americans think through what their constitution might look like. You know, this here is, you know, part of this is from a U.S. history textbook. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's interesting, sort of the idea that there's national civilizations happening all over the world, but America stood empty of mankind and its works. Europeans in the New World is the story of the creation of a civilization where none existed. So that's what most people have been taught. That when, you know, Christopher Columbus arrived in America, he never made it to the mainland, he went to the Caribbean. But when early explorers arrived in America, that there was just like some, you know, wandering nomadic people just kind of hanging around like, oh boy, like it's Wednesday evening, maybe we're going to get discovered this evening and everything's going to be good. But that's, you know, it's not true. It was a piece of mythology that got created to justify the imperialistic actions of colonizers in what they called the New World, which was our old world. It's our old world. We've been here for tens of thousands of years. And so it's not a new world. It's just happened to be a place that some explorers found when they got lost. But you also see, like here in the 1500s, you have Verrazano talking about the people that he found. And a couple of things interesting from this. One is sheets of work copper. So we know there's copper mining going on in Minnesota and northwestern Ontario in particular. So there was mining, there was smelting, there was milling, copper being traded all over the Americas because it was, it was prized sometimes as spiritual items, sometimes as a tool. And then tilled fields, which stretched inland 80 to 100 miles. So just imagine from wherever you are, 100 miles of tilled fields. That's a lot of farming going on. And so why do you have that? You have that because you're feeding a lot of people. This is just one place. And if you have a lot of people, you probably have things like, how do you feed them? How do you take care of waste? How do you protect yourself? How do you govern yourself? How do you educate kids? Just on and on. All those things that are indicative of civilization, and all these pieces of civilization were present all over the Americas. This is the original treaty. This is how we said that we were going to treat each other. It's called Gaswenta. It's between the Dutch and the Iroquois people. But what it basically says is that all these rows of white beads stand for the river of life. It says we're traveling together in this river of life. And the top two rows of purple beads stands for the Dutch vessel. It says everything the Dutch need to be Dutch is in that ship, their language, their culture, their laws, everything. And likewise, that other two rows of purple beads stands for the Iroquois canoe. It says everything we need to be Iroquois is there. Our laws, our culture, our spirituality, everything. And it says we're not to interfere with each other because we're traveling in parallel. And it says there's those three rows of white beads in between those purple beads. And it stands for friendship, peace, and forever. So it says we're joined together in friendship for the purpose of peace forever. That's the original treaty of the Americas. We had treaties with each other as Indigenous people, but this is the first treaty with the Europeans. And it really set the tone for how we were supposed to be treating each other here in the New World. Of course, it didn't really unfold that way, but that was the idea. In 1763, we had the Royal Proclamation. Here's the king, saying there was a lot of fraud going on in the New World. He says, got to stop. But in this, there's a couple things that are really significant. The king talked about the several nations or tribes with whom we are connected. So it's not like wandering nomadic people, it's nations and tribes. They shouldn't be molested or disturbed. And any parts of the territories or dominions as not having been ceded to or purchased by us. That set up our treaty-making relationship with each other. And if they haven't done that, then it stays with those nations as their hunting grounds. Large part of Canada, almost all of British Columbia, is unceded and unsurrendered Indigenous territory. Ottawa, the nation's capital, where Prakash is, he's on Algonquin land. That's unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory in Ottawa, and same up through the Ottawa Valley. So I'm going to skip over parts of history, but just to say that, treaties have been an important part of our relationship. They're nation to nation. Many were done with the French crown and the British crown and what's now Canada. Canada ended up taking over some of those responsibilities from Great Britain in particular at the time of the 1867. But we've been in a treaty-making relationship ever since then, with historic treaties ending in 1923. And it said how we're going to take care of each other. Indigenous people oftentimes did this to try to protect the land. There's different rights. A lot of politicians say we're all treaty people. And maybe like where most of you are, you might be there because of treaty. And so that idea about, learning about not just the Indigenous people of the territory you're in, but what are the treaties that govern where you live? And so we're doing a lot of work right now to try to understand what do some of these treaties that may be 100 or 150 years old, what do they mean in 2022? Lots of work being done in that area. So here's these huge territories, parts of Canada. This is where a lot of the modern treaties have been done. So all across the north, it wasn't that long ago that there was no treaties in the Yukon. Now almost all the Yukon's covered by treaties. Same with Nunavut, same with parts of Quebec. So we're still making treaty with each other. There's a treaty process going on in Ottawa, one in British Columbia, and some in other parts of the country. So we're still in that process of making treaty with each other. We've had this terrible thing that was imposed upon us, second oldest piece of law in Canada, a very racist piece of law called the Indian Act. We know that South Africa even examined the Indian Act for inspiration about apartheid, but it was basically a piece of law, and it still exists, meant to control First Nation people. And you can see some of the things that it did, but a couple of things that are really harmful, and this is outlawing our own form of spirituality, and the treatment of women and children in particular in the Indian Act was really terrible. And some of that, lingering gender bias in the Indian Act continues to today. A lot was dealt with in 1985 and a couple other amendments to the Indian Act after that, but it targeted women because most of our societies are matrilineal and place hold women in high regard. And so this piece of legislation really attacked women. So we've gone through, kind of a tough history with each other in terms of the Indian Act. Then we have residential schools formed to kill the Indian and the child. That's one of the purposes of residential schools. It was aggressive assimilation, civilization, and Christianization of children. Residential schools have been around for a long time. First one just down the road from where I live in Brantford in 1828. The last one closed in 1996. About 150,000 Indigenous kids went through these schools, primarily First Nation people. Some Métis, especially in Saskatchewan, and then later, like in the 1950s onward, Inuit people were being sent either to residential schools or institutions that were similar to this. This was a joint venture between churches and government. Catholic Church ran about 70%, maybe a bit higher, of all the residential schools, but almost all the Christian denominations were involved with residential schools. So you can see like some of the education, the punishment, especially made handcuffs, Christianization of our children, nutritional experiments being done on First Nation kids. This is post-World War II, where we weren't supposed to be experimenting on human beings, but it was being done here in Canada with First Nation kids because they were considered an ideal scientific laboratory. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said this was cultural genocide that happened with our people. And the legacy of that cultural genocide continues on to today. I mean, the last school just closed in '96. And you think about some of the abuses that people suffered and the intergenerational abuse that's happened since then. We've been on a healing journey for some time. One of the things that TRC said in dealing with Indigenous people, Canada did all of these things that add up to cultural genocide and significantly separating children from their family. And that's continued even after residential schools. We had this era called the 60 Scoop, sort of forced adoption of children to other families across North America, even to different parts of the world. So children have been really targeted by the government and by the churches. We've been on a bit of a healing journey, thankfully. There's been some good things that have been done. As Prakash said, that we had this settlement agreement. It was the largest class action in Canada's history until just a few months ago. It set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. set up an out-of-court process for people to have their abuse dealt with when they don't have to stand up in front of a judge. And we've had apologies by a number of the churches. Most recently, we had the Pope apologize after a lot of attempts to try to convince him to apologize. The fact that he's coming here, I think, is going to be healing for a lot of people. I'm really happy that he's doing that. So a couple of things, some of the things that we're working at and lobby the government for is to raise our standard of living. We have this thing in Canada called the Human Development Index. We're way behind the rest of Canada from a human development point of view. And we know that if there was proper investment, we could close the gap, and Canada would be better off on a net basis for having invested in us. But it's slowly happening. But to have communities in Canada that are still under boil water advisories is a pretty sad situation that we're in. But you can see here, one of our big priorities is climate change and dealing with greenhouse gas, clean water, having sustainable housing, all of these things that would allow us to live more in sync with Mother Earth and to take care of her. And these are just a few of the other more political priorities. One of the things that we're seeing, which is a really good thing, is Indigenous knowledge increasingly being applied to how we're making decisions in Canada. So if you look at the Impact Assessment Act, which governs how every project in Canada is going to be assessed, Indigenous knowledge is part of that process. And this is pretty unique for not just in Canada, but in the world, to ensure that Indigenous knowledge is being brought to bear in terms of thinking through how can we mitigate potential harm to Mother Earth. And this act also identifies Indigenous jurisdictions. So not just our knowledge is going to be applied, but our own Indigenous law has the potential to be applied in terms of how projects are assessed and either proceed or don't proceed in Canada. Indigenous knowledge, we've lobbied. It was in a number of the international climate accords, like the Paris Accord and the Glasgow Accord. So we see that being done both in respect of the Earth itself, but also from a medicine point of view, hospitals opening themselves up to having some of our healers come in there to work with Indigenous patients in the hospital. So it's a really interesting time that we're in, and we're just sort of at the dawn of some new ways of thinking about Indigenous people and the rest of Canada relating to each other. We say that Indigenous knowledge is a complex and sophisticated system of knowledge, drawing on thousands of years of wisdom and experience. But it's not sort of locked in the past. It's constantly growing and constantly expanding and taking into account new information. So it's significant that Canada has recognized Indigenous knowledge in such a profound way. We know that Indigenous people that are being asked to, and their knowledge is being brought to bear on issues like climate change through some of those accords that I talked about, but Canada is doing the same thing, sitting down with First Nation and Inuit people in terms of the Arctic in particular, and manage of the land in the Arctic. But this is true all over the world too. We see that Indigenous people are being asked to help work with governments and corporations to figure out new ways of relating to the land. And hopefully that's going to continue. At the same time, as a country, we're going through what people would talk about as decolonization, or really rethinking our relationship with each other. Canada and some countries are very different than other parts of the world where colonists came. They did whatever they did as colonizers, and then they left. Maybe sometimes they were kicked out. Maybe there was a war and they left, but for one reason or another, they left. That's not going to happen in Canada. Nobody's going anywhere. We have treaty with each other. We have relationship with each other. So many of our families are related to each other through marriage. So no one's going anywhere. But a process of decolonization is going to have to happen anyway. And part of that is going to have to be lands are going to be repatriated to Indigenous people so that we're able to sustain ourselves. Because of the same way that we've been treated, the land has been treated that way too. When you think about how developments happened in the past with very little care about the earth itself, that's also true of Indigenous people. I mean, we're in relationship with the earth. So as the earth was sacrificed and hurt, it hurt us as well. And many of our people are now standing up more and more for the earth. And so that's part of healing for her, but also part of healing for us. And so it's an interesting time that we're working in terms of what does this mean in terms of power sharing with each other and decision making and distribution of wealth. It's an interesting time that we're entering into as a country. We're also being guided by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This is going to, I think, have some profound effects on Canada. It talks about our right of self-determination as Indigenous people. It talks about our right for free, prior, and informed consent for issues that are going to impact on our rights and our communities. And again, we've just had a piece of legislation that's 2 years old, about 2 years old, that not even that, maybe about a year and a half old, that recognizes this UN declaration. We're not really sure about all the things it's going to do. My own hope is that it really helps reshape Canadian institutions and make them more accommodating and accepting of Indigenous people and Indigenous rights. But we're going to sort this through. The Supreme Court has really helped us in terms of relationship with each other. Just the idea that we need to be consulted before any development happens that may impact on our rights. Before, government and corporations didn't care about how our rights might be impacted. And projects were approved that were to the detriment of our people. And many of our communities are still suffering, whether it's from mercury poisoning, from waters that they can't drink, from runoff, poison from mines. Many of our communities are still suffering from that because our people weren't taken into account in terms of the potential impact of those operations. But that's changing. So we're into this process of reconciliation, which is about establishing and maintaining respectful relationships that needs a new vision based on respect, but also needs to understand the huge impact that residential schools had on our own pride and self-respect as Indigenous people, but also, and this is from the Truth Commission, the lack of respect that Canadians have been raised to have for their Indigenous neighbors. Many people have been taught that. You just look at, the National Post or almost any newspaper when they write an article about Indigenous people and read the comments section, oh my God. You see just a lot of ignorance and maybe hatred. And that came from somewhere, probably came from their parents and maybe came from their parents' parents, but that's got to change. And one of the things that TRC said, reconciliation is not an Indigenous issue. It's a Canadian one. So it's on all of us here in Canada to be part of reconciliation. I love Michaëlle Jean when she was Governor General, but that's what she talked about. We need to confront history together. That's what Truth and Reconciliation about, righting historical wrongs, kind of thing about refounding our nation. I think that's really profound. At the time of Confederation, there was no Indigenous people there. Well, there's no women there either. And there is no people of different genders. There's no people of many different religions and countries from all over the world. So maybe that's part of what we're going through as a country too, is kind of thinking about, you know, how can we make sure this country reflects all this beautiful diversity that we have? But in particular, like from my point of view, how do we make sure that it recognizes the rights and responsibilities of the first people of this land? We have a unique place in this country. And so we've just gone through this thing in the last year and a half, finding out about these children out in Kamloops. I think it was like a punch in the stomach for Canada. Because we did have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but I don't think it really, you know, soaked in to people about what that really meant. And to find these graves, unmarked graves, and now over 10,000 more. The whole country, I think, for the most part, has either been angry or grieving or bewildered or saying we got to do something different. So this is a bit of a turning point for the country. You'll recall last year it was even like, well, should we do Canada Day or not? This happened in May, and then people were saying, I don't know whether we should be celebrating. Like, what are we going to celebrate? And so a lot of the celebrations were really muted. Our people marched together, everybody wearing orange shirts, talking about every child matters. So we're going through some big changes in this country. You know, one of my heroes, Gord Downey, I'm on the board for the Downey Wenjack Fund. He called upon us. He was the lead singer for the Tragically Hip. He spent the last couple of years of his life really focused on reconciliation. We called it reconciliation. He said, we just got to do something. It wasn't just sort of like a long list of all these things you could do. It's like, just do something. That's what he said. The TRC laid out 94 calls to action. It covers every part of Canadian society in terms of something that we could be doing in the name of reconciliation. And why do we do it? We do it for our future. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about Indigenous kids or non-Indigenous kids or people that are going to arrive in this country tomorrow and their children. I mean, we want a better future for all those children. That's what we're talking about. These are some of those pictures of reconciliation. You see the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners, people marching shoulder to shoulder. The report of the final commission, the final report for the TRC. And then Justin Trudeau, and Murray Sinclair. I mean, a couple of key figures in terms of moving reconciliation forward. People can say what they want about Justin Trudeau. He has really, I think, helped move an entire government, entire country to do some things about reconciliation. That's not easy to do. And I really admire him for the commitments that he's made and for the budgets that have come forward in the last number of years that really focused on things like Indigenous education and trying to ensure clean water for more and more communities. So he's walking the walk, as you would say, in terms of this. There's Gord Downey from Tragically Hip, but you see how the arts have helped shape some of our thinking about reconciliation. This is meant for corporate Canada, but it's really true for all of us in terms of some of the knowledge that we could gain and some of the actions. Many of you may be, leaders in corporate Canada. Well, corporate Canada has a really strong role to play. And I know it's one of the pieces of work that I'm doing with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. We have a reconciliation policy. We have a traditional knowledge policy. We measure. We developed a reconciliation baseline to say, where are we as an organization in terms of reconciliation? And then we measure change to see how we're doing on our reconciliation journey. All of our staff members have been given at least 2 levels of training on reconciliation. And we have a 3rd level that's ongoing right now. And so other corporations are doing similar things. I think we're one of the leaders in Canada in terms of the work that we're doing, in terms of reconciliation. But, you know, all of us can do those things. Reconciliation just isn't for your professional life. It's also for your personal life. And so encourage you to think about that. What are some of the reconciliation actions that you could be doing to help advance reconciliation in Canada? So just a couple maybe closing thoughts. One of them that jumps out here for me is this dish with one spoon. And oftentimes when people do land acknowledgements in Southern Ontario, in particular in Toronto, they talk about the dish with one spoon treaty. And the dish with one spoon treaty, you know, I used to have kind of a simple thought about that. I was talking to one of the elders and I said, you know, I really love the dish with one spoon. And he goes, what do you like about it? And so I told him, you know, it talks about the different Indigenous people coming together and now non-Indigenous people, and we need to share. The dish stands for the world, and that spoon talks about how do we share with each other. And I said, I think that's a really powerful image. He says, yeah, that's kind of it. He said, but the dish with one spoon is really a global economic model. And I said, global economic model, that's a little bit different than what I was saying. And he goes, well, I said, like, tell me. And he says, well, he says, it starts with the dish. He said, the dish is the entire world. And the spoon, it stands for how do we structure things so that we can ensure that everybody is taken care of in a dignified way. Nobody goes hungry. Nobody lives in poverty. So that's really that wise distribution of resources. And there's only one spoon. There's not like a spoon for every one of us or every country. So what are some of those protocols and principles and procedures that you would put in place to say, this is how, let's say, okay, Prakash, you're in charge of the spoon. What would we expect of Prakash if we put him in charge of the spoon? What if he said, okay, well, I'm going to make sure my family's taken care of and to heck with everybody else? Well, he wouldn't be in charge of the spoon very long, I don't think. But I don't think Prakash would do that anyway. But I think we'd all want to consult with each other and say, here's why we picked Prakash to take care of that spoon. And here's some of the expectations that we have from him. And it would be things maybe like those 7 grandfather teachings, like humility and kindness and generosity, but also thinking ahead 7 generations, because the dish isn't unlimited. So we have to do that wise distribution of resources with a view to how can we ensure that our next 7 generations are going to be taken care of as well. And then the elder said the dish has rights. Mother Earth has rights. She has agency. How do we respect her agency? And you know, we're starting to see some of that. There's a river in New Zealand that was given the rights of a natural person. Now there's a river in Quebec that has been given the rights of a natural person. So just think about that. So that river is a person. That means everything that you're going to do that might impact on that river, you have to take into account that river's rights in terms of how you're going to do human activity. I just think that's just really great, because I think it's very consistent with the dish with one spoon, that idea that the earth has rights and we need to honor her in terms of how we conduct ourselves. A couple other things I think about, you know, we're doing lots of changes. Some are symbolic, some are substantive, some are systemic. These are, you know, this is just my simple way of thinking through decision making. I was talking to one of my elders about that, and I said, you know, this is what I do. I think, is this symbolic? Is it substantive? Is it systemic? And not that symbolic is wrong. unless you get stuck there. Then people would say it's performative. And he said, you know, if there's 3, there's got to be 4. I said, oh, well, what's the 4th? He said, well, go away and think about it. Come back and tell me. So I did. And he said, what do you think the 4th is? I said, I think it's spirit. I said, all these things need spirit to be able to move. He goes, yeah, it's spirit. And so that's something that all of us have. We all have spirit. And we can all bring our good spirit to bear on these actions that we're going to do. And we can share spirit with each other. We can put our spirit together to do something really profound. The TRC said, you know, these 4 A's, that part of reconciliation is awareness, then acknowledgement, then atonement, and then action. All these things end up with action. So that's the journey that I think that we're on as a country. And I think it's really exciting. I'm a really hopeful person. I think reconciliation is inevitable. I think it's going to change our relationship with each other. It's going to change our relationship with the earth. And it's going to change the way we think about the earth and the way that we think about this gift that we want to give to our children and our grandchildren and future generations. And I don't think it's going to be easy. That this requires a lot of work. It requires all of us challenging some of the assumptions and maybe prejudices and mythology that we've been raised to believe. I'm going to say this one thing because I really like it. And Prakash will love this because of the time he spent in South Africa. I was doing training in Ottawa a few months ago, and sort of a talk similar to what I just did with all of you. And this woman, she stands up, she says, she goes, you know, I was born and raised in South Africa. She was a white woman. She says, I was born and raised in South Africa. And she said, I was raised to hate Nelson Mandela. Oh boy, she said, my parents just hated him. And she goes, so I grew up hating Nelson Mandela. And then we decide we're going to immigrate to Canada. And we're thinking, oh, Canada, you know, boy, oh boy, they stand up for human rights all over the world, peacekeepers. Oh, what a great country. And she said, and then I get here and I find out like everybody loves Nelson Mandela. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with me? And what's wrong with my parents? Like, how come I was raised this way? So she said, I had to do this like big rethink about, you know, these things that I'd been raised with. And she said, and then I find out about the way Canada's treated Indigenous people. And so no longer is Canada like the greatest nation in the world and the protector of human rights. What about Indigenous human rights? How does kill the Indian and the child sort of stack up with being a protector of human rights? So she said, so now I've had to do this big rethink about Canada too. And I think that's what we're all doing. We've all been kind of challenged, you know, kind of from all those babies that were, and little kids that were found in those unmarked graves. They're challenging us to think differently and to act differently. And that's part of this journey that we're on. This here, Gord Downey said, you know, we're going to learn, it's going to be painful. Next 100 years are going to be painful. We come to know about this young man, Cheney Winjack, who escaped from residential school, escaped. You know, that word is pretty profound, and then froze to death trying to get home. So as we find out about ourselves, but we need to do that in order to call ourselves Canada. And then this is a word cloud. You know, I do this a lot, different workshops I've done. Reconciliation is like, here's a lot of the key components. And they're probably things that you would think about in terms of, yeah, that makes sense to me. Like healing is part of this, not just for Indigenous people, but Canada needs to heal. And here's a whole bunch of things that we need to be doing. But it's a journey. It's not going to happen overnight. We need to be patient with each other too. Not patient to the extent that we accept inaction, but patient in the knowledge that some of these changes are pretty big. and it requires time and effort. So I just want to thank you so much for being able to be part of your circle this evening, and look forward to hearing any questions or reflections or comments on what I had to say, or maybe other things that you've learned as part of your own reconciliation journey.
Thank you, Bob. Wonderful. Thank you for tracing hundreds of years of history in just a few minutes for us. You know, it's not an easy task. And I think it's fair to say that any subject relating to Indigenous people, including in the environment, cannot be complete without giving a context and giving the history, which you have done so well. So we can appreciate in greater depth. And this relates not only just to the environment, but to any other branch of the law, whether it's a health, whether it's legal stuff, without knowing the true history. And the tragedy for most Canadians is that, for the most part, things are changing now. But for the most part, Canadians were never taught the true history of the relationship between Canada and Indigenous people. And so, like this white woman from South Africa, she had to unlearn a lot of things. And similarly, in Canada, we have to learn or unlearn some of the stereotypes, some of the biases that we have. There's a lot of things to be said, but the context was important. And there may be, I'll leave it to Ruhi and Steve to take over from here. But is there anything, Bob, that you can share with us, in particular with your work with the waste management, nuclear waste management, that people may be interested to know the type of work you're doing as it relates to Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, sure. I can sort of give a quick summary of some of the things that we're doing.
Sure.
We've been in a process now for almost 2 decades to try to find a permanent storage facility for used nuclear fuel in Canada. And most of it's in Ontario. And we've narrowed down to 2 areas. One up in the South Bruce in Bruce County, and one in northwestern Ontario, a few hours west of Thunder Bay. But I think a couple things that we've done, and we did this early on, long before I think in some cases people were thinking about this. One is we said to the Indigenous people, the First Nations in those areas, that we would not go ahead with a project in their territory without their consent. So that's a pretty big deal. So we made that promise. And we've worked with municipalities and with Indigenous communities to ensure they had the capacity to be able to understand the work that we're doing, because some of it is highly technical and highly scientific. And that idea about being informed, in our process, we call it informed and willing. In the UN Declaration, it's called free, prior, and informed consent, kind of the same idea. But we've also made a commitment that we're going to incorporate Indigenous knowledge and have Indigenous knowledge and Western science work together to help us make some really good decisions about how we can have the least amount of impact on the land and to do things in a way that's mindful and respectful of the earth. And that's the way that we've been going about our project. We still don't have a site for it, but in terms of how we're developing and designing all the work that we're doing, those are our objectives. And interestingly, most of the design for a deep geological repository, because it says, it's going to be buried in the earth, which is what's happening in every country in the world that uses nuclear power. And Finland and Sweden are the 2 leading countries in the world in terms of these processes. But one of the things that we were told early on, we were told this through ceremony with Indigenous people, but also the people in Sweden have said this too. They said that basically the rocks will tell you the safe place to put this. And sort of that idea that the rocks have agency and the rocks have a story. And it's been interesting because when we send our geologists out with indigenous knowledge keepers, they understand that story of rock and are able to interpret the rock's story from different angles. And when you put them together, again, it's pretty powerful. So I'll have to say I'm really proud of the work that we're doing in terms of being respectful with indigenous communities and indigenous cultures, and putting this safety of the environment so foremost in terms of our thinking and issues of sustainability. I'm trying to understand net zero. I mean, all of these things in terms of to do the least amount of harm to the earth, and where you do harm, to find ways of mitigating that. And one of the things the elders have said is that, you know, say, for example, you need to, maybe it's a blueberry patch, big blueberry patch that people have relied upon for generations and generations, but it's right in the way of where this development's going to happen. Maybe it's a couple acres. Well, maybe you work with the community to do 10 acres of blueberries somewhere else. So it's like going beyond sort of simple mitigation of 1 for 1. Maybe you need to do a 4 to 1 or a 10 to 1, because that's really sort of profound respect and mitigation for the earth. So we're learning a lot from indigenous people. And I don't think that you learn unless you are willing to have your ears open and you approach some of these things in a humble way. And I think that's what we've been taught, is to do that. And it'd be really easy to be arrogant. I mean, when you look at the credentials of people in our organization, there's some really, really bright people. Some of them most highly skilled experts in the country, maybe in the world. But we need to be humble too. So that's kind of the approach that we're taking.
Thank you, Bob, Ruhi, Steve. Bob, if you don't mind, if there are questions and comments that go slightly beyond 8:30, if you can, would be great. If you cannot, we'll understand.
Yeah, I'll stay around for a bit.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Watts and Prakash. That was such a rich and very meaningful presentation to kick off our environmental lecture series for this year. And so thank you from the bottom of our hearts for sharing obviously something that is very close to your heart and spirit. I really admire the concept of minerals, plant, and the animal world taking care of us, having been born and created, as you put it, for us. And in order to give back to Mother Earth, as you put it, that whole system of knowledge that the Indigenous community has definitely is something that we can draw from and learn. But once again, I think you put it very well when you drew the analogy with South Africa and the lady and her upbringing and her her take on Nelson Mandela. So if education starts from those very formative years, then I guess that goes right back to square one, and that's the schools, and that falls within provincial jurisdiction. So I wonder if you're working closely with the provinces and the territories on incorporating some of this indigenous knowledge into school curricula?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things I would say is that, there's been a lot of good curriculum that's been developed with Indigenous people. And for sometimes schools were a little bit reluctant to use it because teachers weren't comfortable with it. But I think they're getting more and more comfortable. I hear from so many people saying, my 9-year-old comes home and they know more about Indigenous people than I do. And so sometimes it's the kids now that are teaching their parents about Indigenous people, which is pretty cool. But, I just say that, I mentioned I do work, I'm on the chair of the board actually for the Downey Winjack Fund. And we work with schools all across Canada. We have a curriculum on reconciliation and Indigenous people that's right now in over 6,000 schools and growing. During the pandemic, our school program tripled and still growing. It's really accelerating. So, we're in a lot of schools. School boards have a lot of material. Some provinces have been better than other provinces. But the resources are out there. And I always like to hear that from people about, my kids came home and they said, oh, we got to go and get an orange shirt, or, all these things. It's our kids that are leading us in many cases. And I just really love that.
Ruhi, can I add something to that, if you don't mind?
Of course.
The TRC in the 94 recommendations that Bob actually mentioned, there is now specific recommendations, which the government has accepted all 94 recommendations, is to do the curriculum for all schools, colleges, universities, law societies, public servants. So those are the recommendations within TRC, which are now being embedded. And hopefully in the next generation or so, many of Canadians will not be as ignorant about the true history as most of us are. So there's hope. And the next 150 years looks, like Bob was saying, hopeful. I think it's going to be a better 150 years than the past 150 years.
Yeah, here.
Mhm.
Very true.
And also, if I may add, some of it has to do with preservation of that knowledge as well. And so during the National Indigenous History Month last June, we invited Dr. Stephen Inglis and Dr. Sarah Pasha-Gumskum. I don't know if you know her, but she's the director of the, I'm trying to remember, of the Cree Cultural Institute in the northern part of Cree territory in northern Quebec. And she's a very strong contributor to the preservation of First Nations culture and history. And so you're welcome to view that video. It's on our website, and it was presented under June of last year. And it's an excellent presentation on the collaboration between museum specialists and cultural centers in preserving First Nations history and artifacts and repatriating artifacts as well. It's a very fascinating presentation. So there was that, and we've also had another speaker in the past who's talked about the social and the health determinants, the determinants of health, the social determinants of health up in the Northern Territories as well. So we have been doing, we have been shining the light as much as we can on this topic. And, but as you said, it just touches on virtually every aspect: health, history, culture. As I mentioned also in our diversity and inclusion series last year, whether you're talking about sport or whatever, there is the land and our connection and our experience with nature that tends to form even our national identity. And so we had one of our former Canadian ambassadors talk about the national identity as well in one of our lectures last year. So these are all very important topics. It just shows how our diversity and inclusion series last year nicely fits into today's lecture, kicking off the environment, which is cross-cutting. And so I'm wondering if anyone else has questions in the audience. Stephen, I don't know if you can see better than me, any hands?
There was a hand up a moment ago.
Okay.
Yeah, I did have. I am Amitabh Sanyal. You can say, call me Amit, AMIT. And thanks, Bob. It was a wonderful information session for you. And it was quite reflecting for me because some thoughts were churning. I come from India where I worked with indigenous people. I'm now living in Ottawa. One question was coming to me. There's this land in North America where Canada exists as a nation. There are other nations also that exist. Same land. And I fear that Canada acknowledges the other nations and they also talk about what their ancestors done to the indigenous people. But is it true also that the indigenous nations also think that Canada as a nation exists? Or does the name Canada needs to be changed over a period of time?
Oh, that's a tough question, because even the origins of the word Canada, sometimes there's a few different definitions of it. It'd be really cool if Canada had an indigenous name, I think, just to recognize the indigenous origins of this country. But I know that in some of the definitions, it's, some say it's drawn from indigenous language. But I think it would be, right now that may be sort of a bridge too far to do that. But I think, some of the thinking behind that in terms of how we think about Canada, not just as a name or not just as a place, but we think about her as something that is alive, and that it's really this land that brings us all together and takes care of all of us. And so what does that mean in terms of how we should treat her? To me, if we could get there, a lot of other things would fall into place. Just to think about the land differently. I'd be really encouraged if that happened. And I just think there's just so many indigenous languages, it may be hard to think about another name for Canada that would, we'd probably end up arguing with each other for a couple decades about what either what language or how to think about it. But I really think just as important as name is what that means in terms of how we feel about a place. And it's really that feeling part that I think is so important.
Thank you, Amitabh, for that question. Is there anyone else?
Not a question, but maybe you can just build on a little bit of Amit's question, if I understood him correctly. And Bob alluded to this in his presentation about it's a constitutional right that Aboriginal people have won in Section 35, which recognizes Aboriginal rights and title and treaty rights. And And from the legal point of view, Indigenous peoples have won all major Section 35 cases. They've got the law on their side, and they've got the facts on their side, and they've got the treaties on their side. The only thing that the government of Canada did was not to honor those treaties. And as you know, the Supreme Court is made up of not a single Indigenous judge on that court. And yet, because the facts and the law, including the treaties and including the Royal Proclamation of 1763 that Bob also talked about, all proof, and in fact, more recently, Minister Mark Miller went on record to say that we have stolen the land, right? Minister has never made that admission. I mean, the courts have sort of come to similar conclusions. But I think the point that the courts are making, as well as Bob is making today, we are all here to stay. Nobody's going anywhere, right? And just a couple of weeks ago, there was another agreement where the treaty with the Prime Minister, the federal government, where the treaty was reneged again, never honored. And there are many, many instances like this. So all Section 35 cases, majority, overwhelming, have been won by Indigenous people. And I think this government, more than any other government, realizes that it is in the best interest of all Canadians to reconcile. And Bob talked about two different reconciliations, but it's actually the same. Reconciliation with Canada as people, but also reconciliation with the land, right? Which goes hand in hand. So there's much more we can talk about and discuss about the history and how Canada has robbed Indigenous people, because the wampum belt that Bob showed clearly states, what the treaty was supposed to be. It's supposed to be moving in parallel, not to interfere with each other. And yet Canada has consistently done that to Indigenous peoples, right? And the realization now that you cannot continue that way. And I saw that NEPA also agreed with you, Bob, that this government, Justin Trudeau, has not really got the credit that he deserves for what he has done on the Indigenous file. And I, having worked on this for the last 2 decades, I can echo that and agree with NEPA as well, that he hasn't got. In fact, I think Perry Bellegarde went on record to say that Perry Bellegarde was the AFN chief, a national chief, who said that this government has done more now than in the last, I don't know, I think 50 years, or maybe we can say even 150 years. Of course, Murray Sinclair says that it's taken us generations to get here. It's going to take us generations to get out of this mess. And the same with the 7 generations that Bob talked about the land and the respect and so forth. So I think we are living in very interesting times where we're shaping a new Canada. And I think all of us individually and collectively can make a small contribution towards that.
Well said.
Very well said, Prakash. Thank you. That's absolutely, I think, very thoughtful. And as you said, it's, Canada is not only being shaped as we evolve socially, economically, but also there's technology as well. And one of the things I was wondering about, forgive me if it's an ignorant question, but I need to ask about this as well. So we're talking about social evolution and so forth, and conscious thinking and awareness raising. But on the technology front and competition, when we see Indigenous peoples and the entrepreneurs that are coming out of the Indigenous communities and the support we're giving them to help develop entrepreneurship. Just how much pressure do they feel when they're competing against much more established companies in their particular areas of industry and sectors? Do you think that they might be under pressure to give up some of their indigenous principles? You know, you talked about the seven grandfather teachings and principles. Yeah. Do you think that the young indigenous entrepreneurs might be under some pressure to give some of that up in order to compete?
Wow, what a great question. You know, I'm get to see some of the development happening firsthand, and I think one of the things that makes a lot of the indigenous companies and entrepreneurs attractive is that they are trying to apply the seven grandfather teachings to the way they conduct themselves, because more and more corporations are under pressure to help achieve net zero, or to meet the standards of sustainability, or to do greenhouse gas reduction. And so in the past, where, you know, corporations may have been able to ignore those things and just do development however they wanted to do it, they can't do that anymore. And I think oftentimes partnering with indigenous people helps them think through how to do things differently. That's not to say that every indigenous company is perfect, or maybe doesn't find ways of being able to compete side by side with anybody. But then again, like you know, I also think about how they give back too. So they might be seen to be sort of ultra competitive on the one hand, but they're supporting schools in their community on the other hand, or they're working, you know, from a corporate social responsibility point of view on other things. So I think sometimes, you know, you got to keep the lens pretty wide in terms of how you're looking at things. But I will say, I think one of the things that, you know, does make our companies and our communities attractive is that they bring a different ethic to the table than some of the other companies in Canada.
How interesting. Definitely another way to look at it. And I have one other question, and then I'll turn back to Prakash and Stephen, see if they might pick up you know, further comments from the audience. But I was thinking about SMR technology, small modular reactors, and given your role at the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, I was just wondering what discussions you might be involved in your opinion on SMR technology and how it can help the Indigenous communities in the rural areas.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, for our corporation, we're kind of at the tail end of the nuclear cycle, so it would be like, what sort of SMR waste in terms of used fuel that we would be dealing with. But I mean, we have to be aware of what's going on in the industry. And I know of a number of Indigenous companies and communities that are partnering with SMR companies to bring that technology to everything from, you know, remote construction camps, remote mining that might otherwise be operating out of on diesel and would be detrimental to the environment. SMR is probably a great technology for those areas, maybe some of the remote communities as well. So I think that, you know, I look around the world and I see how, you know, some different parts of the world are responding to small modular reactor technology. And I think there's an opportunity in all of this for, I don't know, like almost like a bit of a renaissance in terms of nuclear. When you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, nuclear helps achieve probably, I think 15 of those goals as something that is green. The issue is, what do you do with the waste? I mean, and that's true in so many industries. What do you do with the waste? So it's one of those enduring questions. The fact that it's radioactive makes it a bit harder question to sort through, maybe a more emotional one, but it doesn't mean there's not answers.
Right.
We know that there's really good science and really good technology and a really amazing safety record in terms of storage of used nuclear fuel. So that's part of the story that doesn't get talked about a whole lot.
Well, that's fascinating. Stephen, do you have any questions, or do you see any further questions from our friends?
Well, in the chat, there have been accolades. Nipa has also commented, excellent exposition. Puneet and Susan have said thank you for the excellent presentation, Bob. So the general feeling, of course, has been that this has been an excellent presentation. And I think people are quite pleased to have been here, but also very happy to be taking away some knowledge and some things to think about. So I guess we will ask, we'll ask again if there are any other questions from the audience.
No, I don't really have any questions. I think it's a really good topic, and so I just wanted to say thanks for the great presentation. And you know, it's definitely an area where it should be really good. It should be really encouraged for more people to be more aware of. So yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Puneet. Thank you for
you.
joining us. And I did have some other thoughts, and maybe if we have further questions, we can email them separately to you, Professor Watts, if we have any further areas of interest that we'd like to discuss with you.
Yeah, that'd be fine. Prakash has my coordinates, so.
Oh, that's great. Well, if we don't have any other questions, perhaps we can ask Prakash to sum up. I mean, you did a very good summary earlier, but if there's anything else you want to add, Prakash, before we close the session. And
no, I don't really think I have anything else to add. I think it's been covered by Bob, as well as the questions and comments, from the floor. I think the point has been made that, we all have a significant contribution, no matter how small, it will be significant. And we can educate ourselves, the duty to educate ourselves, but there's also a duty to act as well. And so, especially people in our generation, I'm not talking about the ones at school at the moment. I think we have an opportunity of sharing, resources about reconciliation of with indigenous peoples, reconciliation with the land, reconciliation with the environment. I think all of those things are tied in and interlinked. So my request would be just for us to be better informed and take some action, and work collectively is even better. Bob, I don't know how to thank you, my friend. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that Bob is a busy man. And Bob, as you were talking in your presentation, there's a lot of thoughts going in my mind, and I think you and I need to have another offline chat.
Okay, look forward to that.
I think there's a lot of possibilities of, doing something together. And so let's chat.
Okay, we'll do that. Thank you.
well, with that connection made, that's exactly what we do here at the India Canada Friendship Circle. We try to bring people together with common interests and facilitate new connections and friendships. And so thank you once again, Prakash, for introducing us to Bob. And we look forward to keeping in touch, Bob, and perhaps putting you in touch with some of our other speakers who did speak on the other Indigenous topics that I raised earlier. It's nice to build that community, and that's
Sure.
what we're all about here at the Friendship Circle in developing those bridges. So thank you once again for joining us this evening. Bob, Prakash, Stephen, our board members, Nipa, Anne Pollock, Nipa Banerjee, don't see Malti Kiswani, and Dr. Veena Rawat. From all of us, thank you so much. And we look forward to inviting everyone back in the fall. And that will be our next lecture. So stay tuned. It will be on some environmental theme of interest. And if you have any other thoughts and ideas, feel free to send it through our website, any names of speakers or topics that you would like to see in the fall under the environmental theme. So once again, thank you everyone, and we will keep the lines open. So if anyone wants to continue to socialize, we don't have the tea or samosas to offer, but this is the best we have, at least for now. And until we meet again, I wish you all a good night. Thank you. Stephen, you can even add some music for us.
Yes, good
Thank
night.
you. Good night.
Thanks
all.
again, Bob.
Okay.
Thank you, my
Bye-bye.
pleasure.